The rain pounded against the windows of the Carter mansion as 17-year-old Ethan Carter stood trembling in the middle of the living room. His clothes were soaked, his shoes covered in mud, and tears streamed down his face. Across from him stood his father, Richard Carter, a powerful businessman known throughout the city for his ruthless personality. Richard held a broken watch in his hand, the last thing Ethan had inherited from his late grandfather. "You stole this from my office," Richard shouted. "I didn't steal it," Ethan cried. "Grandpa gave it to me before he died. He said it belonged to our family." Richard slammed the watch onto the table. "Enough! I'm tired of your excuses. You have embarrassed this family for the last time." Ethan looked toward his mother, hoping she would defend him. But she stood silently beside Richard, unable to meet her son's eyes. "Dad, please believe me," Ethan whispered. Richard pointed toward the front door. "Get out!" Ethan froze. "What?" "You heard me. Get out of my house." "But where will I go?" Ethan asked through tears. Richard's expression remained cold. "That's not my problem anymore." Ethan slowly walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around one last time. "Dad, I didn't steal anything. One day you'll know the truth." Richard laughed bitterly. "There will never be a day when I call you my son again." Ethan stepped outside into the storm. Behind him, Richard shouted the words that would stay in his heart for the next 10 years. "You are no son of mine." The door slammed shut. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, soaked and heartbroken. He had no money, no friends willing to help him, and nowhere to sleep. That night, he found shelter beneath the roof of an abandoned train station. He cried until exhaustion finally took over. The next morning, Ethan woke up with one thought in his mind. He would survive. He started working wherever he could. He washed dishes at restaurants, carried boxes in warehouses, cleaned offices at night, and delivered packages during the day. People often looked down on him because of his cheap clothes and tired face, but Ethan never complained. One evening, while working at a small bookstore, Ethan met an elderly businessman named Mr. Anderson. The old man noticed how quickly Ethan solved a difficult accounting problem that had confused several employees. "Where did you learn that?" Anderson asked. Ethan smiled. "My grandfather taught me." Impressed by his intelligence, Anderson offered him a job as his assistant. It was the first real opportunity Ethan had received in years. Ethan worked harder than anyone else. He studied business at night, learned investments, technology, international markets, and corporate strategy. Anderson became more than his employer. He became the father Ethan had lost. Years passed. Ethan's small investment turned into a successful company. His first startup focused on renewable energy technology. Within 3 years, it became one of the fastest-growing companies in the country. Ethan never forgot the pain of his childhood, but he refused to let bitterness control him. By the age of 27, he had built an international business empire worth billions of dollars. Newspapers called him a mysterious young billionaire because he rarely gave interviews and never discussed his past. But Ethan remembered everything, especially the night his father had thrown him out. 10 years after that terrible night, Richard Carter's empire began to collapse. His company had accumulated massive debts after several failed investments. Banks demanded repayment, investors abandoned him, and employees started leaving. Richard desperately searched for a solution. One morning, his assistant entered his office with shocking news. "Sir, there's a billionaire investor willing to purchase a controlling stake in Carter Industries." Richard looked up. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Ethan Anderson." Richard frowned. The name sounded strangely familiar. "Arrange the meeting." That afternoon, Richard entered the company's main conference room wearing his most expensive suit. Several executives stood around the table. The doors opened. A tall man in a black suit walked inside. Richard's heart stopped. His face had changed, but his eyes were unmistakable. "Ethan," he whispered. Ethan calmly walked to the head of the table and sat down. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "Is it really you?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." Richard struggled to speak. "My God, what happened to you?" Ethan gave a faint smile. "I learned how to survive after my father told me I was no son of his." The room became completely silent. Richard lowered his head. "Ethan, I was angry. I made a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" Ethan asked quietly. "You threw a 17-year-old boy into the street during a storm." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I regret it every day." Ethan opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. "Do you remember the watch?" Richard looked confused. Ethan continued. "The watch you accused me of stealing." Richard slowly nodded. "I found out the truth years later. Grandpa had secretly transferred ownership of several family assets to me. The watch contained a tiny encrypted storage device. It had financial records proving that one of your business partners had been stealing millions from Carter Industries." Richard's face went pale. "What?" "You thought I betrayed you," Ethan said. "But I was actually trying to protect you." Richard covered his face with his hands. The truth hit him harder than any financial loss. He had destroyed his relationship with his own son because of a lie. "Why did you come back?" Richard asked. "To take revenge?" Ethan remained silent for several seconds. "I came back because I wanted to see whether the man who abandoned me was still the same man." Richard looked at him with tears in his eyes. "And what did you find?" Ethan stood up. "I found a broken old man who lost everything except the chance to apologize." Richard began crying openly. "Son, please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I am sorry." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. 10 years of anger battled with the memories of the father he once loved. Finally, Ethan walked around the table. Richard expected Ethan to shake his hand. Instead, Ethan embraced him. Richard broke down completely. "I thought I had lost you forever," he whispered. "You almost did," Ethan replied, "but I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you." Ethan then revealed that he had purchased Carter Industries not to destroy his father, but to save the company and protect the employees who depended on it. "I'm giving you a choice," Ethan said. "You can walk away with enough money to live comfortably, or you can stay and help rebuild what you destroyed." Richard looked at his son. "I want to stay," he said. "Not because of the company. Because I want another chance to be your father." Ethan nodded. "Then start by being honest." Over the next few years, father and son slowly rebuilt their relationship. Richard became a changed man. He apologized publicly for the mistakes he had made and dedicated himself to helping young people who had nowhere to go. Ethan continued expanding his empire, but he never forgot where he came from. Years later, during an interview, a journalist asked Ethan, "What was the hardest moment of your life?" Ethan smiled and looked toward his father, who was sitting quietly in the audience. "The hardest moment was when my father told me I was no longer his son," Ethan said. "But that moment also became the beginning of everything I became." The audience applauded. Richard wiped tears from his eyes. Ethan continued, "Yes, sometimes people reject you because they cannot see your potential. That rejection may hurt, but it does not define you. What defines you is what you do after you've been knocked down." Richard stood and embraced his son in front of everyone. 10 years earlier, Ethan had walked away from that mansion with nothing but a broken heart. 10 years later, he returned as a billionaire, not to destroy the man who rejected him, but to prove that rejection could never destroy him. And the words, "You are no son of mine," that once broke his heart, became the very words that pushed him to build a life nobody could ever take away from him.